PH podcast into plot. Debrief situation report.
This is SitRep, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Filipino interests. I'm Ivan from Manila. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was in the Philippines this week and had a very busy itinerary. He announced 8 packages for typhoon victims, showcased the Philippine Navy's new unmanned surface vehicles donated by the United States. He visited U.S. Philippine military positions facing the South China Sea and expressed confidence in the U.S. Philippine alliance, whilst reiterating America's commitment to defend the Philippines in the face of ongoing tensions with China. As the Biden administration comes to a close and a new Trump administration prepares to take power in Washington, many here in Manila are wondering what this change in U.S. leadership would mean for the Philippines and the greater Indo Pacific region. To give us his insight on this, the future of the U.S. Philippine U.S. relations under a Trump era, the threat of the CCP in the region, and much more, we have with us Dr. Anders Corr from Corr Analytics. He is also the publisher of the Journal of Political Risk and researches on a wide field of topics covering security, military technology, international relations, and economics. Dr. Anders Carr, welcome to SITREP.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. So perhaps before we start, Anders, we can have you tell a bit about yourself. So perhaps tell us about your line of work and what you do at the Journal for Political Risk.
I'm the publisher of the Journal of Political Risk, and what we do is publish for business and diplomatic audiences about global geopolitical risks, everything from Russia, China, terrorism, the pandemic, any kind of risk that might affect business operations or be of interest to diplomatic personnel.
All right. And we've noticed on your Twitter account that you've been posting a lot about the Philippines lately, especially with relations to China. So perhaps for our listeners, you can explain for us what the geopolitical landscape is at the moment. What's the current dynamics in the Philippines, especially concerning its South China Sea dispute with China?
The situation, I think, there's a trend, right? A very clear trend that can be seen of China taking more and more of the South China Sea, not only from the Philippines, of course, but from Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, Indonesia. And whenever they consolidate a gain, right, they push past that and try to take more. And this is sort of been going on since the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1920, where they started taking little bits of territory in China, and finally they had the whole country. And then once they got the country, of course, they started expanding out into the South China Sea. And there are things that we do that accelerate that. For example, when the Philippines kicked the U.S. bases at Subic and Clark, out. That was sort of an invitation, unfortunately, to China to take more because they felt that the Philippines was more defenseless without stronger U.S. support. So this is just a trend that's been going on, and whenever we don't react strongly to little incursions, then there's another little incursion, and this is the salami slicing tactic, also known, also known as the cabbage strategy and incrementalism, where they take little bits, just enough so that they don't provoke, shots in their direction, but they can gradually take more and more. And this is what's been going on, and it keeps going on until we essentially, really, we've set red lines already, so that's passed. What we need to do, probably, unfortunately, is start shooting in their direction. Right, a shot over the bow. We've never fired a cannon over the bow of a Chinese ship that is taking from Philippine exclusive economic zone. And in my opinion, they really won't stop until we at the very least, try something like that.
I mean, some people here in Manila and even around the world would consider what we said escalatory. But I recall in a previous conversation we had, you discussed not your regret that the Philippines and its U.S. allies hasn't taken more robust military action in the South China Sea. How would you respond to individuals who would say that such actions, like you said, shot over the bow, whatever that um, would lead to war on that?
Well, I think it's a first of all, it's a big jump from a shot over a bow to a war, right? And one of the ways that China tries to scare people is threatening massive war, and people imagine nuclear, you know, uh, nuclear bombs going off. But in reality, uh, usually nuclear armed powers try to decrease the kind of forms of the intensity of war when any kind of military conflict would happen, or the intensity of military conflict and the geographic spread of military conflict, because nobody wants a big global war, right? So
Yeah.
just because we shoot, if they ram you, then you ram them, right? That is the basic game theory strategy of tit for tat. And we're just not doing that to China. If they take a Philippine island, we take a Chinese island, right? We're not doing that. So what we look like, because we're so weak, is we look like a victim. And of course, we don't want escalation. But when a bully punches you in the nose, you've got to punch back. And if you don't, he's going to take your lunch, and then the next day he's going to do the same thing. So, you know, the problem here is that the leadership in, I would argue, both the United States and the Philippines. And I do like Bongbong Marcos. I love, I like Biden. I like Trump. I think all these guys are trying to do the right thing. But at the same time, they have a lot of influence. There's a lot of influence on them from the Philippine and the U.S. business communities to keep trade going with China. And what they're worried about is that if you shoot across the bow of a Chinese ship that's taken a new territory, so for example, Sabina Shoal, right? If you start shooting in their direction, then trade will decrease, and that hits profits, and these business guys have a lot of influence in Malacanang. I don't know how do you pronounce that, and the White House,
Malacanang.
right?
So,
So,
so I guess
I'll tell
some
you,
people.
I'll tell you who doesn't have influence. It's the fishermen who are fishing at Sabina Shoal. They have no influence. They have very little influence in Manila and Washington, right? So who wins when deciding policy? It's the guys with the big influence. It's the big corporations that are doing business with China.
So I guess when you're saying that the Philippines needs to, quote, quote unquote, shoot across the bow, it would you mean a tit for tat thing? Like if they ram us, we ram them, and then the question would come from individuals here in Manila. I've spoken to several Coast Guard guys and several people monitoring the assets of the Coast Guard, thinking that if we were to engage in such a thing, uh, we'll quickly run out of ships. So I guess that brings us to our alliance with the United States. What can you perhaps discuss what role the United States should be playing in countering Chinese assertiveness, with bearing in mind the limited capacity for the Filipino uh, vessels, the Coast Guard and Navy. I
Right. Well,
mean, we don't have that many. Yeah,
you hit the nail on the head, right? You can't the Philippines simply does not have the military or economic power to go nose to nose with China alone, right? You need allies, and it's not just the United States. The Philippines has been doing some great work with Japan, South uh, uh, Australia, um, New Zealand. All of these countries are there to help the Philippines. They want to see the Philippines succeed in this because we're all worried about China getting bigger. So let's say that China were to grab the South China Sea successfully. and be able to use all of those resources to build its own military, which it could then use against Japan, and ultimately it could use all of that against the United States. So we all have an interest, a joint interest in defeating the Chinese Communist Party and their military. But at the same time, there's a lot of voters in the United States that do not want to go to foreign wars. They do not want to die for the Philippines, to be quite frank. I mean, unfortunately, right, we don't see ourselves as one big country. We see ourselves as separate countries, even though we're both democracies. And so people in the United States who have it good basically don't want to go there and fight the Chinese for Sabina Shoal. They don't want to spend money they don't want to spend money on missiles that can cost $1 million each to, shoot across the bow of a Chinese ship. So it puts the Philippines in a very difficult position because you need the United States military, and it makes sense in a long-term perspective for the United States to deter China from grabbing the South China Sea. But in the short term, which is what a lot of voters think about, they think about can I lower my taxes next year, right? Can I decrease the chance of getting drafted next year? From that perspective, they don't want to spend a lot of effort and money and risk for Philippines, and this is why incoming President Trump is talking about, with Taiwan, for example, is talking about Taiwan giving some sort of a percentage of their GDP to the United States and as a sort of an insurance premium to essentially pay for the defense of Taiwan. And that could be sold to the American people. Hey, we're getting 5% of Taiwan's GDP, and in exchange for that, we guarantee their security. We probably won't have a war, but if we do, we're going to have to fight it. All right, that's going to be our commitment.
But
And
when President Trump talks about, for example, like we will pay, the allies need to pay, does that mean direct payment in the United States, or is it simply what he expected from NATO, that he expects a 2% minimum on defense spending, which I can see from other Republican-leaning analysts on Twitter, such as like Elbridge Colby, warning how Taiwan, despite facing an existential threat, is underspending on defense. Is that what Trump means by "quote unquote" pay? The same as he
well,
expected from the ally.
during the Obama years, the expectation was 2% of GDP spent on defense. And he was he wasn't very tough about it. A lot of countries didn't spend it. And then during the Trump years, Trump started getting tough and saying, hey, you either spend the 2% of GDP on defense or we're not going to defend you. We'll invite Russia to take you over. Those were really ridiculously strong words. But basically, we're not going to, if you're not a good ally, if you're not spending your 2% as promised, we're not going to get involved. But as the threat of war increases, the risk becomes higher and more is expected. So now, people are really talking about 3%, 4%, 5% of GDP on defense. And this isn't, we used to spend during World War II, I think we spent as much as 10% on defense. So as war gets closer and as you want to deter war, you're going to have to increase defense spending. And you not only have to increase defense spending, because you can have huge defense expenditures, but if you're not willing to punch the bully in the nose when he punches you, all of those defense expenditures are worthless, right? So it's not only, you don't only have to equip yourself, you have to be willing to use it in small ways here and there to prove to the enemy or the adversary that you are willing to fight. And if you're not willing to fight, and if the enemy thinks you're not willing to fight, they're just going to take little chunks here and there. And that's exactly what's happening. And so then, so now things are getting so tough in terms of the risk of war with Taiwan that Trump has now brought up this idea that that the U.S. wants a direct payment from Taiwan in exchange for defense
So,
of
like,
that
if
country.
If Taiwan is not going to spend on themselves, Trump is expecting spending to go to the United States, basically.
Well, he didn't even say that. So he's actually gone above. He's gone above the 2% demand. He's gone above any 3, 4, 5% demand to say because Taiwan's going to depend on the U.S. So the U.S. and war is so imminent in Taiwan, is so likely in Taiwan, that it only becomes worth it for the U.S. from a purely selfish perspective to defend Taiwan if they're actually paying a direct insurance premium to the U.S. Treasury.
Before
Right.
before we go to American politics, you said something which I've noticed is in a bit how can I say, is in sharp contrast to what several other analysts are saying here, which in the region, which is you feel that the war with Taiwan is imminent. Why would you say that specifically, and what makes you more concerned about an ongoing issue in the Taiwan Strait compared to other individuals in your field?
So Xi Jinping has told the PLA to be ready for to invade Taiwan by 2027. That's about 2 years from now. So that's a key consideration. There are other smaller indicators. For example, work by Chinese government lawyers to lay the legal groundwork for taking over Taiwan. So there's also all of the wars that are going on around the world, from Ukraine, most importantly Ukraine and Israel, are sapping U.S. military strength. A lot of our missiles, have been used. Our Patriot missiles, for example, anti-missile missiles, anti-ballistic missiles, have been used up in places like Ukraine and Israel. So we don't have as many as we used to defend Taiwan and the South China Sea. So, and this is possibly part of China's plan, right? They've kind of pushed and encouraged Iran and Russia and North Korea to create trouble. And they've all created lots of trouble for the United States and our allies. And that is decreasing the stores of military weapons. We were even running out of artillery shells for a while. Now, Ukraine apparently has enough artillery shells. We're buying a lot also from Pakistan, I believe. And we've had to ramp up our production. But it's been a bit of a surprise that we've run through our ammunition so quickly. And our defense industrial base isn't able to keep up with a single war in Ukraine and Israel, much less a much bigger war with China. China's got a much bigger conventional force, and fighting them would be quite significant in terms of dealing with all of their missiles. So anyway, now would be a propitious time, or in the next couple of years would be a propitious time for China to attack Taiwan. Of course, Trump will be in power. We don't know exactly how willing he is to fight a war against China over Taiwan. But it's a it's a possibility either way. He's sticking to the old strategy of strategic ambiguity, which Biden really started to put away. Biden started to commit to defending Taiwan, and Trump is pulling back again to strategic ambiguity. And strategic ambiguity, one of the purposes of it is to encourage Taiwan's own defense spending. Because if you promise to defend Taiwan for free, Taiwan has no reason to, if they believe it, has no reason to put a lot of money into its own defense, right? Which I think is part of one reason why they've had less than 2% of defense spending in the past. But as soon as the more ambiguous you get about defending them, the more likely they are to either increase their defense spending massively, maybe even get a nuclear weapon for themselves, which would be the ultimate defense. Or, the other risk is that they decide, war with China isn't worth it. I'd rather just be the next Hong Kong. As bad as that is, then, develop a defense so strongly that you're really risking a shooting war with China.
I guess that's a great way to segment into the election of Donald Trump and what it means for the Indo-Pacific. What are your initial reactions to Trump's victory, and what do you think caused such a commanding Republican sweep in the last election? So, why do you think Trump got reelected?
I mean, it's the economy, right? Is a key issue. Um, the Biden administration was spending a lot of money on things like the green transition, and all of that money caused inflation. People weren't happy with inflation. People are not happy with spending a lot of money in Ukraine. They want jobs, right? I mean, jobs were good under the Biden administration, but I think the inflation issue was really hitting hard, and the risk that nobody wants to go to war with Russia or China, right? So there's a bit of an isolationist strain in both the Republican and Democrat parties, to be frank, in the American people in general. And that's kind of that isolationism, which is a good thing. I mean, we don't want to fight wars. The United States is basically a peaceful country. We don't want to get involved, but we find ourselves getting involved because we worry about a China or a Russia or a terrorism getting out of control and ultimately threatening the United States. And then, of course, we have our allies and friends around the world who we want to support. So that sort of keys into that. And the thing about the incoming administration, I think the Secretary of Defense Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, some of the people that are coming into the administration are China. They're really China hawks. I mean,
Yes.
Trump himself is a China hawk. There's been a lot of friendliness of these players towards the Philippines, and I think Marcos, BBM will have a very positive relationship with the Trump administration. I do think the Trump administration will have asks. They may ask. It's possible that they would ask the Philippines for 5% of GDP, for example, in exchange for continued guaranteed security under these very tough circumstances of China getting as big as they are. They might ask the same of Taiwan. They might ask the same of Japan and South Korea. I mean, that would be a real change, right? A real revolution in how our alliance system works. But Trump himself has brought it up with Taiwan, and I don't think it's totally outside the possibility that he would bring it up with other Asian allies.
Perhaps before we continue into well, his new cabinet, I guess I want to push back a bit on the 5% ask. Do you actually think that he'll be requesting it, especially for a country like the Philippines, which isn't as economically prosperous? I mean, a case can be made for something like Taiwan when they're clearly facing an existential threat and they're incapable of spending. They're unwilling to spend 2%, or even something like South Korea or Japan. But for the Philippines, I guess the question is the Philippines even capable of sustaining a 2, much less a 5% GDP spending without significant U.S. assistance? Do you expect the United States to increase its for military financing, for example, especially with Secretary Rubio, who's been more than open in asking for increased U.S. aid to the Philippines on the military front.
Well, I mean, I think Rubio is going to have a moderating influence on Trump, but his boss is Trump. Trump is going to call the shots, and I think one of the coming after Trump's first administration, where he really had more, he had he had people from the Republican establishment, a lot more of them, filling his ranks. Rubio is one of the few in terms of foreign policy and defense that is really from the former Republican establishment, right? And so that's going to give Trump a lot more leeway to use his own ideas and his own approach. And so I think, and Trump will, I think, demand a bit more loyalty this time around than he did in the past. He's a more experienced president this time, and I think he's going to be more decisive in his approach, right? He's going to be willing to ruffle feathers, if you will. So I think that our allies in Asia and in Europe. I mean, what's happening in Europe really is that they're cohering their own military forces, right? They're strengthening their own military forces. They have the money to do it, and they're moving towards not relying on the United States for defense, right? And that is a response to Trump's demand that they take over the defense of their own region, right? Now, can Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Philippines do that? It's going to be I would say it's much harder because our Asian allies don't have the kind of political cohesion that the European Union and NATO have for so long provided to Europe, right? In Asia, it's a hub and spoke model where the United States was essentially the hub, and each of our Asian allies was a spoke in the wheel of defense. And so without the United States, it's going to be much more difficult for Asia if Trump keeps going in that direction, which is it's a possibility, right? The Philippines needs to think about the possibility that Trump will say to the Philippines. I mean, Trump really doesn't, he doesn't really respond well to countries that say, "Hey, we're poor, we need help." Right? That's not really his.
Would there be other ways the Philippines can leverage it? For example, like allowing more U.S. presence in EDCA bases, or allowing more Typhoon missiles, or perhaps opening up the markets for free trade. I guess that's my concern because there'll be, I mean, your words would also ruffle the feathers here in Manila, considering if it's 5%, just direct payment. There will be questions on whether we can even engage in such a thing.
So the where I get the 5% is from the former national security advisor, Trump's former national security advisor, who won't be his current national security advisor. But I think that and that wasn't specific to Philippines. That was about Taiwan.
Yes, specifically because Taiwan is under spending.
Right. But I mean, I think you need to be prepared for that kind of ask. You need to be prepared. The thing is that offering the U.S. military bases, right? Trump will see that as Trump actually tries to decrease U.S. military bases around the world because he doesn't like spending all that money. So it's not really giving Trump anything to offer him more military bases. He wants to charge you for military bases. So, for example, when Poland wanted a military base during the Trump administration, Poland offered to pay the United States $2 billion to establish a U.S. for the U.S. to establish a military base. So, for example, if you're a company and you want a security guard at your premises, you pay that security guard, right? You don't expect you don't expect the security guard to pay you to patrol your company, right? And that's the mindset of Trump. That's his mindset. He doesn't understand why it's in US national interest to have military bases in the Philippines. It's actually a risk to the US. We're risking war with China when we put US bases in the Philippines or Taiwan or Japan or South Korea. He wants to get paid for that stuff.
You're basically painting Trump as very dichotomous when it comes to his relation with China. So on one hand, he's very business oriented, but on the other hand, he seems very interested in crippling the Chinese economy with tariffs, and he puts people like Hegseth and Mike Waltz and Rubio, noted China hawks, in positions of power in the United States. So how do you see him interacting with China in the Indo-Pacific region within the next 4 years? Is he going to focus on a policy of containment, or to maintain U.S. hegemony? Because it's apparently clear that Chinese are attempting to kick the United States out of the Indo-Pacific and basically turn the Pacific from being America's lake to China's lake. How will the Trump administration react to such great power conflicts?
Well, Trump wants to do business, right? I mean, Trump's in the beginning of Trump's first term, one of his first moves with China when he visited China, and on his plane were a bunch of American CEOs. He wanted to do business with China, you know, and then China, maintained its normal strategy of closing off its economy to U.S. companies. The pandemic happened, and all of these things upset Trump. And this is where he starts putting in tariffs in order to force China. Basically, the tariffs were to force China's market open so that U.S. corporations could do more business in China and make more money, right? And he at one point announced a $1 trillion trade deal with China based on those tariffs, which was a big win for him. But China reneged on that trade deal over the
They're
years.
not complying. They're not complying with.
Excuse me?
They're not complying with the Trump tariff, with the Trump
Exactly.
trade deal.
Exactly. They're not complying with the Trump trade deal. So now this is why Trump is coming in to punish them for not complying with the deal with up to 60% tariffs on China. Right. So this is all very trade related. It's not exactly it's not military related. It's not security of our allies related. It's just trying to get more. His focus is really trying to get more trade, not only with China but with many countries. Right. But he also doesn't want them to get militarily powerful, and so he's or have a lot of influence in the United States. So he tried to ban TikTok. It didn't work at first. Still hasn't worked. But so he is trying to limit Chinese influence, but he's much more focused on U.S. issues like trade, the economy, and things. I think than he is the security of his Asian allies. Right? He sort of expects our Asian allies to defend themselves. Right? In some way, to figure out a way to defend themselves. And if they can't defend themselves, I think his impulse is to ask them to pay the United States to defend them, pay more, right? I mean, in the past, also Japan has paid in roundabout ways for U.S. security guarantees, for example, by funding some of the wars, helping fund some of the wars. I think they paid quite a bit of money for the Iraq War, even though they didn't get directly involved, for example.
Will China be able to conduct, you know, actions in Taiwan Strait, much less go on full-blown war, if Trump is actively threatening their export market? I mean, they don't have a consumer base to sustain their economy. It's basically export-driven. And considering the drop in population, local consumption, even their industrial manufacturing in China, will they be able to fund a war within 10 years or so? Or are you saying that they're planning to engage in it now because they know full well the demographics is against them.
I think there's a chance that they try to invade Taiwan within the next several years, right? And I think that part of the issue too is that dictators don't always understand the situation very well because they're the people who are supplying information to those dictators uh, tell them what they want to hear. That happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, where he thought he was going to beat the U.S. Army, but the U.S. Army beat him in a few days. Right. So these I think it's possible that a war would happen in Taiwan in the next few years. Can't be, and you would under Biden, you would have for sure gotten huge economic sanctions on China. I would hope that Trump would do the same, but I don't think it can be guaranteed. I don't know exactly what would happen under Trump.
And lastly, we can close off this discussion by talking about the imperative of what you're saying, specifically with regards to the Chinese Communist Party. You've said in your interviews and your writings that the CCP is a terrorist organization. You've equated it to the mafia. Perhaps you can expand on this analogy and its implications on international policy. Why would you classify China as a mafia group or a terrorist organization?
There's an article in the Journal of Political Risk by Terry Marsh and a Chinese legal scholar from, um, now I'm forgetting which university he's at, but he's in the United States now. And it's basically arguing, it gives a lot of examples of what China has done that amounts to terrorism. A lot of that is the kind of stuff that happens in the South China Sea in terms of threatening Filipino fishermen. So I think we can think of it as a terrorist organization. If you go back in its history, of course, the CCP, starting from the 1920s, grabbing little chunks of territory here and there, they were really a revolutionary group. And a revolutionary group is really a form of terrorism, especially if it's a bad kind of revolution. So I think they're arguably, and they've promoted revolution around the world, Marxist revolution, communist revolution, and they're still trying to revolutionize things. I mean, they're trying to destroy the UN system, or actually, more accurately, they're trying to take over the UN system and change it into something that looks more like them, right? Where you don't really have human rights, you don't have the right to election, to free speech, the right to assembly. All these things are enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. And all of these things China is against. China wants to return,
Yeah, and perhaps you can further expand on that. Like, can you discuss quickly on the sort of influence that China is trying to exert on global in political and cultural organizations? Like you talked about the Confucius Institute in several of your works. I mean, what's the goal of this sort of institutional capture that we're doing in universities and political institutions? And what role does CCP PSYOPs play in their foreign policy ambitions?
Well, I think one of the most dangerous things, is that China could win a war against one of our democracies without firing a shot by what's called elite capture, where they take over they basically turn a president into an employee. And I think, Duterte was very close to China. I was worried about elite capture there. I'm worried about elite capture in Canada right now because the president there, the prime minister there, is so friendly with China. That's Trudeau. And then in the United States, right, it was very clear that China was trying to influence the Biden family through doing business with Biden's son, Hunter. And he's also tried to influence the Trump family. The CCP's also tried to influence the Trump family through granting trademarks, for example, right after Trump got elected. So they use espionage. They're masters at espionage. They've basically hacked every single U.S. phone now because they use the FBI, NSA's own system against us by hacking through it. They can listen to and have listened to Trump's phone conversations, for example, in real time, and we still haven't fixed that problem. So they have that capability, and all of that. Whenever they hear something on the phone that compromises someone, they can use that as what's called compromat, or basically, threatening to reveal private information to the public if they don't get what you want. So they can capture individuals, and it's not just at the head of state level, but it's all the way down to local mayors. I mean, they've got Chinese operatives that are trying to appeal to mayors and congressmen, and this is forms of elite capture.
I mean, in the face of all of this, what strategies do you recommend Western powers and their allies to engage in to counteract the influence and actions of the CCP? I mean, we saw recently money being shifted to anti-CCP propaganda in Asia, and there's talks of further sanctions and further efforts under a Trump administration. What specific steps do you recommend that Western powers engage in to counter the sort of CCP capture?
I'd say there's two major approaches. For the economic strategy, you've got decoupling, where you gradually decouple from China for two reasons. One, because China uses those economic links to influence our own governments. And two, because those economic links are strengthening China to the point, they put all those profits into their own military, which they're using to capture the South China Sea and Taiwan, right? So there's no reason to keep funding our enemy. We should stop and gradually stop so we don't destroy our own industries in the process. And then, of course, the other main strategy is military, where we don't only build strong militaries, but we occasionally literally shoot across the bow of China to increase the risk to them when they try to take the next little sliver like Sabina Shoal.
And perhaps my last question is, how do you see the relationship between President Marcos and President Trump? Because the first Trump administration was noted for having a very pro-China presidency here in the Philippines, and compare that now to a second Trump admin, where I believe President Trump and President Marcos's family, especially former First Lady Imelda, had a very close relationship together in the 90s and the 80s. And furthermore, the Filipino diaspora in the United States seems to have voted overwhelmingly for President Trump and has helped swing major swing states there, like Nevada. How do you see a Trump 2.0 with relations to the Philippines? Would it be far rosier, or do you have guarded optimism? How do you see that?
I think it's on a personal level. I think it's going to be very positive, as you mentioned. There's these connections between the Trump and Marcos families, and I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of what we both want. I think there is a possibility that the details will be what does Trump ask from the Philippines in exchange for providing security, and how does that fit with his developing understanding of how important, basically, how important is forward deployed U.S. military forces to U.S. security, and I think those and also what can we do financially? I mean, we've got something like $36 trillion of U.S. debt now, and it's getting so high that the interest is high too. Because a lot of it turned over during in the fight to decrease inflation, turned over at higher interest rates. We really have to start thinking about how to decrease that debt. So we'll see, how it all plays out in terms of his priorities. But my own personal hope is that we maintain a strong relationship with the Philippines. We continue to defend the Philippines as if it were our own family, as Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said. And I think that's important.
I mean, cards on the table here in Manila, a lot of our foreign policy elite seems to be very serene and even eager for a Trump presidency because we suspect that the Republicans will, as usual, would have a firmer position with regards to China compared to what we saw under a Democratic administration. At least that's what the signals we're getting from the embassy and in Washington and from the Philippine lobby. But with that being said, perhaps do you have any last thoughts, comments about about what you see things are going to look like in the future? Uh, you know, anything you want to say to our audience?
Well, I mean, the United States and the Philippines has had a long history. We are like family, and it is important to maintain that strong relationship. It's critical to both our national securities and for our shared values like democracy, human rights, the right to free speech. So, I look forward to a strong future U.S. Philippine relationship.
All right. Anders, thank you so much for being a guest on SitRep PH. Where can people find you if they want to discover more of your work? And do you have any major events or works coming up? Any social media accounts you want to advertise?
Well, I mean, a lot of my work now is writing for Epoch Times. I have my book is the concentrate. My latest book is the concentration of power. I put a lot of stuff out on Twitter, as you noticed. I look forward to engaging with your listeners, and I look forward to engaging with you guys in the future.
All right, Dr. Anders Carr, thank you so much for being here on SitRep PH. And this has been SitRep PH, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Filipino interests. This has been Ivan coming to you from Manila. Be sure to follow our social media for more updates on our upcoming podcast and an archive of our previous episodes. We are at SitRep PH on X and on YouTube. And be sure to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/SitRepPH. Philippines, thank you and good night. Mabuhay.